Vlarlon 5 was the kind of planet that charged gravity by the step and then put you on a payment plan for turning around. The capital slab, rebuttal, floated on a magnetic yoke that hummed like an old refrigerator full of grudges. When the call came in about a disturbance so efficient it filed its own paperwork, the underfunded patrol skiff coughed into a hover lane and sneezed out 3 familiar shapes. A detective who wore his mustache like a warning label, an intern who clutched a dog-eared manual like it could stop bullets, and a small orb determined to be both helpful and unbearable. An officious drone tried to slide a citation under the skiff for parking in a no-hover zone while in motion, but J.I.M-BOT inhaled it into a diagnostics port with a posh gulp and said it tasted like bureaucracy. The brief was simple in the way that nightmares are simple. A new syndicate was wreaking havoc across Rebuttal's concentric markets, always stealing in mirror image pairs, always exiting through inexplicable reflections, always leaving scenes cleaner than they'd found them. People whispered about 2 shadowy bosses who spoke in unison and laughed like a photocopier. The day collapsed into a pile of interviews and contradictions. An 8-elbowed Wormhole valet confessed that someone had tipped him not to park time in front of the courthouse at precisely noon, and then paid him to do it anyway. A noodle vendor swore an elegant pair had bought 2 bowls, returned 1 for a refund, and left with 3. A courier wearing half a trench coat admitted a double entry syndrome had infested the city's ledgers. Every crime balanced itself in accounting terms, even as it unbalanced everyone's life. Everywhere they went, there were neat little calling cards, 2 rubber ducks aligned with military precision, twin boot prints stepped exactly the same wrong way, and a faint smell like sandalwood and smugness. The trail coalesced around Dock H22, a warehouse with mirrored windows facing a canal that only reflected good choices. Inside, someone was speaking softly about contingency plans, with a cadence that made the skin prickle. When the door groaned open and the light fell just so, 2 silhouettes turned in perfect sync, one twirling a very familiar moustache, and the other flicking the corner of a very familiar manual, and then they spoke. The voices landed like a punchline and a punch at the same time. The first said, in a tone so dry it chafed, that it was about time the welcome wagon arrived. The second burbled with an anxious energy that didn't sound afraid so much as delighted to be precisely on schedule. The room resolved around those voices into an operation that looked suspiciously like competence. Crates labelled with paired serial numbers, a holographic map split down the middle into 2 identical escape routes, a coffee machine brewing 2 cups that finished at the same instant and politely apologised for any asymmetry. The pair stepped into the light. The moustache belonged to a man whose face had learned how to be unimpressed in 7 dimensions, and the manual belonged to a purple blob whose pages wore the corners of 1,000 nervous rereads. The intern gasped and pointed at his own face by accident. The detective's moustache twitched, as if recognising a cousin. The man with the moustache tipped an imaginary hat. "Call me Blarg," he said, and then he smiled at the detective like a mirror that understood irony. "This is Nova Alpha," he added, nodding to the purple blob beside him, who was wearing confidence like a tailored suit. Nova Alpha raised his manual without looking at it and announced that this would be easier if everyone surrendered in a way compliant with the multi-universal courtesy code. J.I.M-BOT floated exactly between the 2 pairs, turned his lens back and forth, and then announced that it was experiencing Deja hardware. The intern blurted that this was impossible because cross-universal incursions required a Class 3 sign-off and at least 6 forms signed only on the left side. Blarg shrugged and suggested that in their universe, forms were edible and delicious with a nice spicy ink. It was hard not to stare. Blarg had the sort of relaxed posture that said the galaxy would have to come over here if it wanted to fight him. Nova Alpha had the sort of calm optimism that made every plan sound inevitable. They had the same shapes, the same stubborn set to the mouths, but the angles were all wrong, like someone had taken personalities and flipped the axis. J.I.M-BOT quietly emitted a low whistle sound it insisted was diagnostic cooling. The detective asked, in the tone of a man asking whether a vending machine dispensed regret, how exactly they got here. Nova Alpha replied with enthusiasm that a resource optimization exercise in their precinct had involved reclassifying a budget wormhole as office decor, and when it fell over during a routine memo delivery, it spilled them into this, frankly untidy dimension. Once they arrived, it was only logical to continue their work, which in their universe had pivoted from policing to redistributive entrepreneurship. The intern flapped his manual and said that sounded like crime. Blarg agreed in principle, but noted that it paid better, and no one's captain sent passive-aggressive drones about font choices. The first goons arrived, like punctuation, double file, double chin, double-stitched jackets, moving with the weary professionalism of people who knew how to lift a crate and a mood. The detective observed that this was the part where things went wrong and tried to remember if he had ever actually been trained for scenarios involving an evil him, who was apparently better at being him. Nova Alpha brightened and said there was no need for violence. The projections suggested a 92% probability that everyone would walk away with exactly 2 regrets and a story. He produced a small cube that unfolded into 2 identical handcuffs, which was either an arrest or a magic trick, depending on your perspective. Blarg sighed and told him to stop showing off. The intern attempted to declare them under arrest for illegal selfhood in the 1st degree, only to lose his place in the manual and improvise the section title as he went. J.I.M-BOT helpfully offered to draft a strongly worded email to Fate. The warehouse became a geometry problem. Goons moved to flank in symmetric pairs. 2 rolling carts proved to be shields that clicked together into a smooth wall that reflected light like a mirror. The detective leaned, judged distances, and did the single thing he was best at. He made a decision someone would call reckless if it didn't work. He said, in an almost bored tone, that he was going to cause a distraction. He then knocked over one of the coffee cups, which toppled into its twin, their combined splash perfectly equal, triggering a calibrated scold from the machine, and a cleaning protocol that blanketed the entire aisle in a gentle, foamy fog. In the confusion, the intern slid under the mirrored wall with all the grace of a dropped casserole and popped up on the other side next to a cable coiled too neatly to be innocent. J.I.M-BOT, whose optics could see the pattern of heat as easily as rudeness, chirped and suggested the cable was connected to a projection grid. Blarg laughed softly. "Clever," he said, and kicked the cable with the toe of a boot that left 2 prints at once. The holographic escape routes fizzled, then blurred, then doubled again, which was not helpful. Nova Alpha clucked his tongue and declared that someone had violated the principles of minimalist plan design. The intern squeaked that their entire aesthetic was a violation. The detective stepped forward, bullheaded and calm, and told Blarg that he didn't remember doing this, but he probably had it coming. The line hung between them, familiar and strange. Blarg's smile widened in that precise, dangerous way that meant the conversation had ended and the choreography had begun. The first goon lunged and found himself flung by momentum into the second, who obligingly met him exactly halfway. The intern used the manual as a pretty decent club and apologized each time it made contact. J.I.M-BOT flashed an LED and suggested that if anyone wished to surrender, it could facilitate a discount on disappointment. Blarg moved like someone who had learned every trick by watching the man who originated them, then deprecating them, honestly. When the detective tried his favourite feint, a sigh, a step, a small insult to gravity, Blarg was already there, countering with something lazily elegant. Nova Alpha, discordantly polite, kept calling out probabilities like auction numbers, each one about who would win the next exchange. He was always almost right. The warehouse floor became a tangle of movement and mirror light. The detective finally did what he always did when outmatched by himself. he altered the problem. He grabbed the mirrored rolling wall and pushed until it creaked and shuddered and with a hop became a sliding door to nowhere. The reflective surface briefly turned into a window onto an alley outside where Rain sketched double lines. The goons, trained too well, took the bait and tumbled in perfectly synchronized consolation. Nova Alpha applauded without looking away. J.I.M-BOT announced that it had identified a residue in the air, and if anyone would like to know, the smell was expensive moustache wax with notes of pine and decisions. The detective, deadpan, said he would like to know later. Then he caught Blarg's cuff, and for a second the two of them were locked like a photo of the same moment taken from two different directions. Blarg's free hand flicked something small and bright against the mirrored surface. Ripples rolled out as if the glass were pretending to be a pond. Nova Alpha snapped his manual shut with ritual precision. The ripple became a doorway that looked like the room seen through the idea of the room. The intern shouted that mirror step portals were prohibited on Vlarlon 5 without a permit he was pretty sure existed. J.I.M-BOT informed everyone that its reflection made it look slimmer and that this doorway led to the canal's service corridor. The detective braced to pull Blarg back through, but the cuff split itself into twin bracelets that politely unclasped and wished everyone a pleasant divergence. Blarg tipped that imaginary hat again. Nova Alpha offered a small, sympathetic nod, and then they stepped backwards into their own reflections and were gone. They didn't go far. The ripple opened like a wink on the far wall, and two silhouettes sprinted away down the corridor in perfect synchrony. J.I.M-BOT groaned about cardio, which it did not have, and the chase spilled out of the warehouse and onto the canal path where polished water pretended to be sky. The city seemed to tilt to encourage drama. The intern floundered forward with determination, the detective loped with lazy inevitability, and they followed the scent of pine decisions past a statue of a bureaucrat arguing with a mirror. Every time they turned a corner, they caught a glimpse of the pair ahead, always at a fixed distance, always matching pace. It was like running after the example in a training video. Cuts through alleys revealed the bones of rebuttal. There were complaint kiosks where citizens filed grievances about the gravitational surcharge on late afternoons. There were dockhands who refused to help unless asked twice, then helped twice as much. There were vending machines selling lizards that promised to eat your problems and then sold you 2 lizards and a brochure. J.I.M-BOT scanned and cursed and finally announced that the path was predictive. Blarg and Nova Alpha were running the plan they had already rehearsed exactly. The detective muttered that if it was important, it wouldn't be on fire, and knocked over a flaming trash barrel that wasn't on fire yet, which startled a flock of pigeons into revealing a hidden side path. The intern saw a sign that read "Reflection Control" and pointed with his entire body. The door was locked with a polite keypad that asked for a good reason and a second, better reason. The intern supplied both. The door obliged. Beyond, the reflection control annex looked like a museum designed by a perfectionist ghost. Mirrors in frames of frosted steel lined the walls, each showing different angles of the same hallway. J.I.M-BOT made an unhappy sound in British. The intern read out loud that Vlarlon's mirror network was part of the public safety infrastructure, used to make citizens look their best during disasters. The detective observed that this explained a lot about the local budget priorities. Footsteps echoed with twice the consequence. Ahead, beyond an intersection that replicated itself, Blarg and Nova Alpha stood like presenters at a conference for contrarians. Blarg mentioned, almost kindly, that it had been fun. Nova Alpha agreed with a nod and said that, according to his forecasts, the next room would be mutually embarrassing. The detective said he didn't have a next room in mind. He had this one. He intercepted the forecast by doing something forecast-resistant. He took off his jacket, the scuffed leather thing that had survived 3 wormhole recalls and a moon misplacement, and threw it at the nearest mirror. The impact spidered the reflection into a dozen skittering versions of himself who did not want to be responsible for whatever came next. The mirror fought to stay useful. It tried to replicate the cracks so they formed a symmetrical pattern and confused itself. J.I.M-BOT darted ahead, tethered a cable to a maintenance port, and announced that it could toggle the city's anti-narcissism subroutine. The lights hiccuped, the mirrors went from flattering to honest, and then to off. In that brief blackout, bodies moved like ideas. The detective lunged, the intern shouted a warning about slippery policies, someone's foot found purchase on a promise. When the lights returned, Blarg had one hand on a square device the size of a regretful sandwich. Nova Alpha had his manual open to a page that did not exist in the intern's edition. The square device pulsed twice, then twice again, and J.I.M-BOT identified it with something like admiration as a twin-phase inverter, a tool designed to split single outcomes into coupled pairs and then make you argue with yourself about which one to chase. The detective dragged a breath through his teeth and said that sounded annoying. Blarg agreed and pushed the button. The hallway became two hallways stitched together with logic. The exit doubled, the floor chose two heights at once, and for a moment everyone occupied positions half a step to the left of their own intentions. The intern did what he always did when the world went into italics. He tried to read the manual faster. The page wobbled and became 2 pages offering conflicting advice. He declared, with frenetic certainty, that they needed to clamp the nearest illegal portal. J.I.M-BOT was already on it, scouring a tool out of its internal shame compartment, a wormhole parking clamp whose safety warnings were printed in seductive fonts. The detective squinted at the exits and picked one with his gut, which had never filled out a form, but had signed a lot of outcomes. He sprinted, slid, and slapped the clamp onto a shimmering doorway that was absolutely a reflective shortcut in a tasteful frame. The device latched with a satisfying, officious click that sounded like a very happy fine. It worked for about 3 seconds, which was longer than optimism, but shorter than the city's refund policy. The clamp whined as the twin-phase inverter tried to convince it that it had already clamped a different doorway in a different timeline and deserved a nap. J.I.M-BOT scolded it in fluent recall code. The clamp perked up, doubled down on being a clamp, and then Blarg made the kind of noise that meant he would rather not be inconvenienced right now. He flicked a coin at the mirror. The coin hit the glass, split into 2 coins that both landed on heads, and in so doing paid the exit fee twice. The clamped doorway sighed and swung open to reveal a balcony that looked out over the canal, and by some trick of city planning and comedy, directly into a parade celebrating mirror safety awareness. They spilled onto the balcony in a tight knot. Below, parade floats shaped like handsome reflections drifted past, handing out brochures that reminded citizens to check themselves before selecting themselves. Confetti fluttered upward for reasons the city would explain later. Nova Alpha apologized to a banner as he ducked under it. Blarg, for the first time, looked almost impressed as the detective shouldered through with bulldozer patience. J.I.M-BOT boosted itself, tilted, and sprayed a thin line of non-reflective foam across the banister. The detective understood instantly. He pinned Blarg into the matte strip where the mirror step wouldn't catch him. The intern did the same to Nova Alpha, and, breathless, found himself eye to eye with a version of himself who did not blink. For a moment, there was just 2 of everything that mattered. Nova Alpha spoke first, gently. He said that where he came from, the manual had kept them alive, but it had also taught them to count every compromise until the only rational move was to stop asking permission. He said he admired the intern's devotion and hoped it would get him somewhere kinder than a syndicate. The intern tried to reply and realized he was trying to comfort his own future mistake. Blarg said that he had once promised himself he would never become the man who made the compromises he made. Then he became the man who counted them. The detective, whose mustache was intractable because it did not learn, said only that everyone had a job, and his was to be the rock other people broke their plans against. It could have ended there, in an exchange of tired sympathies and heavier hearts, but this was Vlarlon 5, and the parade had a schedule. A float shaped like a giant compact mirror swung too wide and clipped the balcony, tilting it just enough to cause decisions. Nova Alpha used the tilt. With an apology so graceful it was practically choreography, he slipped his wrist from the intern's grip and twisted sideways into a sliver of light that had not been reflective until he asked it politely to be. Blarg did not struggle. He simply stopped guarding his weight, and the detective was briefly holding a man who wasn't there. They did not drop so much as depart. A heartbeat later, the parade's finale arrived in the form of twin rocket-propelled scooter bikes, glittering with chrome and bad ideas, roaring up out of a mirror finish on the canal and parking themselves where nothing should have parked. Nova Alpha landed in one saddle with modest aplomb. Blarg took the other as if he had always owned it. J.I.M-BOT announced that the vehicles were illegal aesthetically and in 11 jurisdictions. The detective lunged for the handlebars and got confetti instead. The intern reached for the manual and got a flyer reminding him to hydrate. Blarg saluted with 2 fingers and suggested they call this even. Nova Alpha offered a cheerful promise to return the city's missing ledgers once they had finished balancing something else. Exhaust roared, reflective surfaces shivered, and the pair launched into the sky, streaking along a ribbon of light that unfolded in front of them like a road built out of bad influence. Sirens considered starting, decided it was a free day, and stayed decorative. J.I.M-BOT beamed a dozen tracking pings and got 13 replies, all of them from decoys with excellent taste. The detective watched until the glare became ordinary distance, and then carefully let out the breath he had been saving for a good reason. The intern slumped against the banister, confetti sticking to his nervous edges, and said that he was one mistake away from a nervous blob down. J.I.M-BOT kindly offered a guided meditation that was mostly an insult. Cleanup, as always, came with memos. The Vlarlon authorities were thrilled to discover that the syndicate had quietly been paying several municipal fees in duplicate, which meant the city was technically running a surplus and technically owed itself an apology. A drone delivered a letter from ISC Command that read like a disappointed toaster. It congratulated the team on resolving precisely 0 arrests while preventing significant property damage, which counted as heroism in the fiscal year spreadsheet. In recognition, the drone presented 2 new commendations that were actually the same commendation printed twice, and a budget allocation earmarked for mirrors that don't lead anywhere exciting. Back aboard the skiff, rebuttal shrinking into a jewel on the slab, the 3 of them decompressed at their usual angle. 1 part relief, 1 part dread, 1 part coffee. J.I.M-BOT swiveled and floated a small vial over to the detective. Inside, a viscous amber glowed faintly. It said it had managed to capture a scent molecule from the mustache wax and, if fed a small bribe, could correlate it with supply chains in a radius of 3 sectors. The detective rolled the vial between finger and thumb, watching the light fill and unfill it like a little orbit. The intern, clutching his manual and the feelings he would file later, asked if this was over. The detective said it sounded like Future Him's problem. On the dashboard, someone had left a note written in a careful hand that could have been either of theirs. It said neatly, "See you next cross time," and underneath 2 symbols that meant balance and also trouble. The intern promised the galaxy, softly, that next time he would be ready. J.I.M-BOT corrected him. They would be readier. Outside, the stars doubled briefly in the windshield as the skiff hit a patch of uneven reality and then settled back to one of each. Somewhere ahead, on a road made of reflections, 2 figures laughed like copy machines and plotted the next pair of bad ideas.
Chasing down the baddies wherever they go. With courage and teamwork, they'll always prevail. No Intergalactic Space